Hi, bio class. Welcome back to another video lecture. Today we're going to be talking about conservation methods for biodiversity, which is a great follow-up to 5.2, which is about threats to biodiversity. So we started off in chapter 5 talking about why we value biodiversity and different types of it, some things that humans are doing that are kind of causing problems, and now we're going to follow it up with some of the things that humans are doing to prevent that. Though we won't be quite as specific as we could be because there's a lot of individual efforts. So today we're going to talk about what natural resources are, the different types of natural resources and how we manage them, different methods of protecting biodiversity, different methods of restoring ecosystems after they've already been damaged, and some of the laws that we have surrounding all of this. All right, so a natural resource is anything, abiotic or biotic, that's found on Earth that we as humans value at all, which generally means everything. There's two major types. There's the renewable type and the non-renewable type. And there's two ways to use them. Sustainably, which you can read as responsibly, or exploitatively, which you can read as without any foresight to the future. All right, so let's start with renewable resources. Our definition is a resource that is replenished by nature faster than we consume them. Now, some really classic examples of renewable resources are solar power, wind power, trees like forest plants, cotton, sugarcane, right? These things come back quickly. Livestock, water, right? Water refreshes with the rains and the water cycle and all of that. Now you'll notice up here, I say, or that they can be faster than we consume them. We can definitely cut down trees faster than trees grow. But if we're properly managing it and having a little bit of foresight, we're not going to cut down all the trees until they're totally gone and then there's no way for them to come back. That would make them non-renewable. Non-renewable resources are resources that are found in either very limited amounts and or that they don't come back on a human timescale. Now, we will see more coal in the future and more oil will be made in the future, but we're talking hundreds of millions of years in the future, and that's not really in the human scope of how we think about refreshing a resource. So yes, while there will be coal in 1 billion years from our waste, that's not functionally useful to us. So for our purposes as humans, non-renewables don't come back. You'll notice that my examples of nuclear gas, coal, oil, these are all fossil fuels. These are all found in the rocks. It's that kind of slow. Getting them is damaging, and there's only so much to get. So when we look at renewable resources compared to non-renewable resources, non-renewable basically means we can use it up, and renewable resources mean if it's properly managed, it'll last us forever. Now, if not properly managed, some of those renewables can become non-renewables, especially our biologicals. Wind and solar we're probably not going to use to the point that they can't come back, because those are powered by the sun, and so far we haven't started messing with the sun yet. But we used to say that rocks and mountains were more powerful than humans, and we've really messed those up. So we're not going to rule it out as never going to happen, but right now we don't seem to have the tech to do it. But biological renewable resources we can send to extinction, or we can degrade a resource and an ecosystem to the point that it can't come back in that location. You'll notice my picture of the Easter Island heads there on the right. And the idea here is, and it's worth noting that those are actually full-size human statues. They're not just heads. If excavated, they go down and expose a real person. You can see the shoulders on this guy over here. And that just keeps going down. They just happen to be buried by sediment up to their necks. It's believed that Easter Island did not used to be the grassland that you see on it today. Right? There's a bunch of grass in that picture. It is believed through archaeological digs and things like that Easter Island actually used to be forested. And based on its climate zone, it makes sense that it should be forested. However, the civilization of Easter Island was rich in resources and it wasn't plagued by war, and they ended up building quite a large and prosperous civilization, as displayed by these huge statues that clearly were time and resource intensive, and an impoverished civilization wouldn't be able to devote that time or resources to making those. One of the big mysteries of Easter Island used to be, how did they get those statues down to the beach? It would be physically impossible for a tribe of people to lift them. They're just too massive. And again, through archaeological research, we found that they probably cut down trees and rolled them along these trees to these locations, and then used pulleys and stuff to lift them upright, which seems entirely manageable. But there are no trees. The civilization very likely used up every last tree on the island and kept cutting down smaller and smaller and smaller trees to use for firewood and construction and tools and things like that. And eventually, there are no more trees on the island, and there are no more seeds or trees to make seeds to replace the trees on that island. Now there are no trees on the island, and the whole civilization died because they completely depleted that resource. That renewable resource of trees, which grow back over time, was so poorly managed that it became non-renewable. So when we talk about biological renewable resources, we do have to manage them appropriately, because you can degrade them to a point that they're unable to come back. And the practice of using them responsibly is called sustainable use. Sustainable use is using a resource at a rate that it can replace itself or be recycled without causing long-term environmental damage. In the past few slides, we referred to that as properly managed. Sustainable use goes a little bit past that, and it's not causing any long-term environmental damage to the ecosystem that the resource is coming out of, or in neighboring ecosystems and areas that we're not damaging them in the extraction of that resource. This means that when we're taking and cutting down trees for timber, we're not clear cutting. We're taking only medium growth trees. It leaves the old trees to continue to seed the area, and it leaves the young trees to continue to grow up. With that example of the forest and logging, we're doing it more selectively, we're doing it slower, and we're not causing damage that it can't come back about. Now, you can imagine that by letting the smaller trees grow and the bigger trees make more seeds, what's going to happen is we're going to get more trees to continue harvesting faster. Sustainable use is good for the ecosystem, but realistically, it's also better for our economic values as well. We get more trees if we don't destroy them all at the very beginning. The forest can continue supplying those resources to us. If we don't destroy the soil that we're using for farming, we can keep using it for farming. Sustainable use is better for the ecosystem, but it's also better for the economy as well. Okay, so biodiversity gives us these natural resources. How do we protect them? In the United States, as is my background, we have a lot of national protections. We create areas that we say, okay, industry can't come in here. There's no drilling for oil. There's no mining. We're going to curtail logging, and it's just for conservation and biodiversity, and generally also recreation, because a trail system isn't that destructive. I mentioned the United States, but they're not the only country doing this. Most countries have national parks, national forests that are designed for recreational ecological use only. There are some locations that are allowed for very sustainable use and recreation, but not very intrusive things like mining or clear cutting or drilling for oil, which generally have a larger ecological impact than mild logging sustainably done. There's also some international protection, not just because each nation is doing their own thing, and currently about 7% of global land is under some sort of protected status, which feels like a very small amount, but there are 7-8 billion people in the world, so maybe it's not that small. I don't know. But in addition, there are some mega reserves being created by the UN and by countries and in international waters and stuff. And these are bigger than most national parks because by having bigger area, we're reducing fragmentation, we're reducing edge effect, we're keeping this bigger, pristine area. Additionally, mega reserves are used for conservation only. Absolutely no logging, no industry, nothing, just conservation. And recreation is only allowed on the very edges. And part of the way that they make these mega reserves so huge is that the inside is kept super pristine. And then they have the normal kind of protection on an area that surrounds it. That way there's some direct economic value, but there's a lot of conservation, aesthetic, and scientific value being preserved in the inside of it. And that allows us to have this buffer on the outside and pristine on the inside. It's really good. Often you can go to places like this that are biosphere reserves or UNESCO World Heritage sites are worth visiting for these reasons. When we talk about saving places, we generally want to make the most bang for our buck, right? Creating a mega reserve in the Sahara Desert is probably not going to be saving us all that much biodiversity. Some, yes, sure, but there's probably more biodiverse locations that we could be protecting, and those are called biodiversity hotspots. And you can see all the biodiversity hotspots on the map over here. The light gray is land, the white is water. And you'll see a lot of biodiversity in the tropics and in mild climates around the Mediterranean. Let me get my pointer out. All right, so we can see in the tropics, we can see in the Mediterranean, we see down here, again, the tropics, this mild climate. We see the Galapagos, we see Madagascar, we see New Zealand, right? These places are very unique. And when we talk about that uniqueness, we're talking about biodiversity hotspot. And these are areas that have super amounts of biodiversity, especially in the form of what's known as an endemic species. And an endemic species are species that are only found in one location. To be classified as a technical hotspot, you have to have 1,500 plants that are endemic. Not just 1,500 different plants, but 1,500 different plants that are endemic, that are only found in that part of the world. Additionally, to be recognized for the kind of protection that we want to give biodiversity hotspots, 70% of the original habitat also has to be destroyed. So we're looking at things that are super, super diverse and have already gone through a lot of trouble. Colombia is almost in its entirety a biodiversity hotspot. And the amount of biodiversity in Colombia and Ecuador and Panama and Central America and down the west coast and the Andes is amazing. And as these countries become more industrialized, most of them are fairly industrialized, but as they become allowed to play a bigger role in the global theater as their conflicts die down, we need to make sure that we're protecting the biodiversity that's in there. And that they don't make the same mistakes that places like America have as we've wantonly destroyed much of our ecology. Another thing that we should consider is creating biological corridors. And these are things that help alleviate some of the damage caused by habitat fragmentation. The idea is that you kind of, whatever's causing the fragmentation of the habitat, in the picture on the right, you can see a highway that's really disrupting this forest. And so they build this grassy bridge over the highway. And as you can see, it's pretty massive. It's wider than 3 or 4 buses, and it's got trees, and it's got some lakes up there to encourage animals to go up and use it. And the general idea is that deer and bears and mice and insects and microbes and whatever can transfer between these larger forest ecosystems without going through the danger that is the road. And that allows populations to move between larger habitats. It keeps the genetic diversity in those populations higher because they're not isolated from each other, which would be inbreeding. But it's not all good. There are some problems. There's still edge effect. That corridor is not necessarily the same ecosystem as the one around it. Look around it. Let's have a look here. We see over here, right? This is decidedly very forest. And this is very forest and stuff. But our corridor is not. Our corridor is mostly grass, maybe some shrubbery. Maybe over time, we're hoping ecological succession comes in and brings the forest across that. But right now, that's a different ecosystem. This is a different ecosystem than the stuff around it. And that's edge effect, and edge effect has a problem. Also, animals don't get it. Sometimes they still try and cross the road because they don't like look around for a hallway. It's not something they've been trained to do. Additionally, that habitat is still fragmented. It only has this one brief little connection. It's still not as good as a large connected habitat, though keeping those intact is very challenging. Corridors are good, but they are disturbing the ecosystem that they're in, which can be an opportunity for invasive species to get in. It's still creating an edge effect and some other problems, but they're better than not having them at all. Okay, so we discussed biodiversity, we discussed some of the ideas of protecting areas that are still good. What about bringing back things that are already damaged? Which we can kind of do. Realistically, it will happen. If you give something enough time, it will come back to goodness. Some things take very little time. An example, a lightning strike, a tree falling, these are recovered in 5 or so years. They don't take up very much size, though, right? They're relatively small. Landslides start taking 10 years. Floods, depending on the area of flood, if it's caving up like 100 square kilometers, that flood might take 100, 150 years to come back from. A city will take 900 years to turn back into whatever it was before. Removing all our groundwater. These are taking up, tens of thousands of square kilometers, and they're going to take thousands and thousands of years to come back from. So we're really talking about, again, a timescale that's not necessarily human friendly for stuff like industrial pollution, groundwater exploitation, nuclear bombs, acid rains. These are all human caused, right? All the yellow ones are human caused. And so if we're causing those problems, we need to help speed up that timetable. We have a couple ways of doing that. One of the methods directly after an accident is called bioremediation. It's this idea of using living organisms. Oh, I spelled living wrong. Generally, bacteria, plants, or fungus, animals aren't as good at this, to detoxify a polluted area. We've got microbes that eat oil, like that's their food source is oil. So when you have like the BP Horizon spill, they would drop these microbes and they would help eat the oil. This is not a magic cure. They are not capable of eating all the oil. It is not fast. The oil disperses. It gets into the sediment. It gets into other animals. We see biomagnification. It doesn't clean it up in 2 days. It takes a lot of time, and in that time, there is still damage being done. That being said, it's still faster than not doing anything. You can also get plants that'll suck up contaminations into the roots, and then it deposits it inside the leaves of the plant and the stems of the plant, and then we'll come in and it will harvest the plant, and then we'll deal with that contamination safely. And so that's a way to start to remove it. It can become a problem if animals are eating those contaminated plants. Again, we can see that biomagnification occurring, so we have to be very careful with how we manage and deal with the animals in those areas. Another method is biological augmentation. So the idea here is that we're adding a predator to a degraded ecosystem to help control a different community member. The population has gotten so high that it's causing problems. You'll remember wolves changed the river. The idea that there's so many deer in Yellowstone that they've eaten all the trees and vegetation, there's erosion, and it's clogging up the rivers, and it's not enough food for anything else. They bring back the wolves, and they eat down the deer, and then the vegetation comes up, and all the stuff that used to live in all those plants comes up, and eat those plants, and the things that eat those things, and like it's all much better because we've added these wolves that used to be there, and now they're helping everything. We can also use it for direct economic benefit. The other example I give here is ladybugs eating aphids. Aphids destroy crops. They put their little proboscis in the crop and they suck up sugar water, and that opens the plant up to disease, and it removes the nutrients that the plants want, so less crop yield, etc. So they add ladybugs, which love eating aphids. Cool. And so now we get more money for our crops. Great idea. Until we accidentally added the Japanese beetle, which looks like a ladybug except it's orange, it doesn't have spots. And this is an invasive species and it doesn't have any natural predators, and it causes its own set of invasive species problems. So you'd think, well, okay, we need to bring in this invasive species for the Japanese beetle that's eating all these things and it's going out of control. So we bring in a predator for that creature. Well, then that creature, right? Like if it's not thought out and done carefully, biological augmentation can have its own set of problems. But if done well, like wolves change the river, you're bringing in a native predator, then it generally works out pretty well. Some other things that we do to help protect biodiversity is we pass laws. And the United States has done this, and many other countries have done this, and occasionally there's international laws that prevent the transport of endangered species and things like that. The United States, the three big laws are the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act. The Clean Air Act says here's a huge list of chemicals and stuff, and these are the amounts that is not safe to put out into the air. And if you put out more than that, you're going to be fined. And that makes it economically not a good idea to do that. So your company chooses not to save money. Likewise, same idea with the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act. Makes it harder to destroy habitat of those species, and there's huge fines for people that kill those animals and things like that. Most ecologists' problem with these various laws is that they don't think that the levels that are allowed are strict enough. They're like, oh yeah, you let out this much pollutant, and that's better than letting them do whatever they want, but it's really not enough. We're still seeing huge problems. Additionally, they're not always well enforced. And finally, the fines aren't enough. Some companies might decide that it's worth it to pay the fine because it's so much cheaper to just dump their chemicals in the water than to properly clean them up. So there are some issues with those laws, and we still need to step up how we're working with them. So in conclusion, there's a lot of stuff going on that we're getting from the biodiversity, namely natural resources, and how we harvest those and how we use them has to be done carefully and sustainably so we don't cause problems. But we didn't already know that, so we did cause a lot of problems, and now we're working to protect our biodiversity by creating parks and mega reserves and identifying hotspots that need protection so we don't mess them up. And there's some stuff that we're doing to restore ecosystems like bioremediation and biological augmentation and such, as well as laws that generally keep our pollution levels from getting too high again. Thanks for listening. If you want to help support this teacher, you can donate by having your homework done for our next class. That way you'll be best prepared. Thanks. See you in class.